All right, well, I'll just say quick hello to everybody who's on, and then I'll switch right over to the presentation. My name is Kyla Fullenwider. I am a fellow at the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Prior to joining the Kennedy School, I was the Chief Innovation Officer at the US Census Bureau, where I helped start a number of initiatives kind of largely focused on open innovation, but also human-centered design and behavioral science, and how we can leverage those practices for increasing participation across the hundreds of surveys that the Census Bureau does, including the decennial. Today I am really going to focus my talk on the role that cities can play, and we're not going to get too deep into tactics today. That's going to be an opportunity for down the road, but kind of just giving a background on what some of the challenges are that we're facing going into the decennial, and how cities can start to kind of think about ways to approach some of those challenges. And then I'll provide some resources at the end. So just a quick snapshot of what we're going to cover. So we'll talk a little bit about what's at stake. We will talk about what we mean when we say the first digital census, and I have that in quotes for a reason. And then we're going to talk about, like I said, some of the challenges and threats that are new in 2020 and some that are kind of old, evergreen, if you will. And then a few steps on how to get started, and like I said, some resources both from the Census Bureau that can be helpful, and some that my team at the Kennedy School has been developing. Great. So what's at stake? Okay. The top line here is that the census is our nation's foundational data set. Just 101 reminder, it determines congressional apportionment, but also for the purposes of cities and states, how over $800 billion in federal funding is distributed every single year for a decade. It's really the data that underlies all of our, or much of our other data. It is used in research and algorithms and infrastructure planning. The short version is that this data is really the lifeblood of our democracy. And if we don't get it right, there's a lot that we're at risk at getting wrong, both visible and invisible. The other point I want to make is that we're about to embark on really a massive national modernization effort of enormous consequence. It's the largest non-wartime effort our country does. If anyone remembers the launch of healthcare.gov, we remember, for those of us that worked in federal government, what a sort of mess that was. And the hope here is that as the census goes digital for the first time, we don't suffer that same fate. And finally, for the purposes of today, I want to talk a little bit about what I mean when I say get out the count, and how cities can really be on the front lines for protecting our nation's data set, but also for ensuring that they get their fair share of federal funding and dollars. So what's at stake? When I talk about it in a quick way, I point to three things: money, power, and truth. So like I said, at least $800 billion in federal funding to states and government every single year. Power, right? So congressional districts, but also state legislative districts, school districts, voting precincts. So how we draw lines, right? And how sort of power is distributed. And then finally, something that I feel like isn't talked about so much, but is perhaps as important, if not more, than the money and power part, is the truth part. And as we're seeing in the headlines right now, the privatization of data is really what's driving the world's most valuable companies. And so as our data becomes increasingly privatized, our public data, or our sort of data commons, as I like to say, is only going to become more important. And protecting it in the same way that we protect our national parks, our library systems, other public goods, is really going to be important in the coming decade. Okay, so a little bit more on the money part, because I suspect that if you're here from a city, that's a lot of what you're thinking about, and rightly so. So as we mentioned earlier, $800 billion in federal funding across approximately 300 program areas, ranging from Medicaid to Medicare to CDBG grants. As one example of how that money gets spent out over states, I've looked at some of Andrew Reamer's work, and he's a really fantastic resource if you're interested in really understanding the nitty gritty of how these dollars are distributed. But Kentucky, my home state, which is a small state, receives about $15 billion a year across just 50 of those federally funded programs of the 300, right? Louisville, which is a relatively small city, a big town, or a small city, as we used to say when I was growing up, makes up about 17% of the state's population. So a city the size of Louisville could have as much as $2.5 billion at stake across just those program areas. These are really big numbers for cities. And just 5 of the program areas that Andrew Reamer looked at, Medicaid among them, in fiscal year 2015, the overall loss per person missed in the 2010 census was a little bit over $1,000, right? So if you multiply that by, even a 1% undercount of a city or a state, those numbers get really, really high. Census Bureau data actually is used to determine direct grants through HUD to cities. So in 2015, again, we look at some of those numbers, they're really, really kind of mind-blowing, right? Almost $1.8 billion in grants and the community development block grants. Houston, which had a 2.4% undercount, I think, in 2010, received a total of about $188 million in block grants, just based on their 2010 count, which again, a little over 2% of an undercount means they lost out on some money. Hard to say exactly how much, but it was significant. And finally, the last point I want to make here is that something that cities are really going to need to pay attention to is ensuring that their children under 4 are included in the counts. This is the most undercounted age group. And as it turns out, the largest counties in the country have an undercount that's much higher than the national average. So according to Bill O'Hare's work and research and other great research on the undercount of children, that was 7.8% versus 4.6% across the country as a whole. And 77% of the net undercounted children occurred in the largest counties. So what that means is dense urban places need to be especially careful about making sure that their children are counted, right? Because that's Medicaid money, that's CHIP, children's health insurance money, WIC, school and free and reduced lunch school programs. So a lot of really critical programs for children under 4 and children in particular that are in poverty. Okay, so you know that there's a lot at stake. And so I'm going to add one more piece to this, to the stakes here. And that's that we are about to embark on what we're calling, quote unquote, our first digital census. That does not mean there won't be the ability to respond on a form. There absolutely will be. But what it does mean is that it's going to be the first time that we can respond online. Which I'll talk a little bit about some of those implications in just a second. But first, just a little bit of a thought exercise, because for those of you who were working on the census in 2010, it was a very different world, right? A lot of people still had flip phones. Most people have smartphones now. We still went to get our movies at Blockbuster. Not all of us, but some of us. Taxi cabs, were still the sort of, mode of public transportation in a lot of cities. Now we have Uber and Lyft and other car sharing apps. travel agencies, hotels, brick and mortar stores. So this is just a sort of fun, but in some ways very, I think, meaningful description about what has changed in the last decade. And so as you're starting to think about developing your engagement and get out the count strategies for your city, it's really important to kind of look and do an assessment and take stock of what has changed where you are since 2010. Economically, socially, are there new populations in your city, for example, that may be hard to count? How are people communicating and sharing news, via social media or closed messaging systems like WhatsApp? So these are really important things to think about as you're gearing up to embark on this effort with us. When we talk about a digital census, what we're talking about is sort of both the landscape that we're in, we're sort of this digital decade, right? We of course will have an online form where folks can take the census from their computer, at their laptop, over the phone, both calling in or submitting over your smartphone. That's a huge change, right? That's a really, really significant both opportunity and threat, because that means there are a lot more opportunities for people to participate, but a lot more ways for bad actors to compromise these systems. Hiring of the hundreds of thousands of enumerators and census staffers is taking place online for the first time. And finally, enumerators, the folks who are out in the field, who are going door to door and knocking on people's doors who have not self-responded, are going to be using handheld enumeration devices. So altogether, we have a pretty vastly different landscape for the census than we did in 2010. So what are some of the challenges and threats that we need to be thinking about as we go into 2020? First and foremost, hard to count populations. So hard to count populations historically have been around 18% of the population, give or take, who you talk to and where you are. This has always been an issue. This is nothing new. Hard to count populations have been around since the very first census for different kinds of reasons. What's a little bit different this time, and I'll talk a little bit about the political and media environment, is that we have a kind of confluence of circumstances that are making our already hard to count populations even harder to count. And one of those things is something that I think is often misunderstood or underreported, which is that in 2010, we had a influx of resources through the Recovery Act funds that allowed at least $150 million to be invested in reaching hard to count populations across the country, including the hiring of what the Census Bureau called partnership specialists. And these were sort of boots on the ground folks who went into those really hard to count communities, who spoke the languages, who knew the local trusted messengers, and were able to really turn people out. That entire workforce is gone, and that entire funding stream is not there. That's significant. And I think it's going to impact cities in particular, and that's something that I really want cities to pay attention to, is how are they deploying boots on the ground, where historically the Census Bureau has done that in a more kind of systemic way. Workforce. So again, another difference between 2010, we were at the height of the Great Recession. We have incredibly low unemployment right now. That means hiring is going to be very, very difficult. Non-citizens, I don't know if it's for the first time, but for the first time in a long time, will be ineligible to work for the Census Bureau. That's an important sort of, thing to note, because a lot of the communities that need to be engaged earliest, and when I say early, I mean starting now, are immigrant communities, and some of the folks in those communities may not be citizens yet, and so not being able to hire non-citizens presents a bit of a challenge in some of those hard to count communities. for many of you, I'm sure you've been reading the headlines about the citizenship question, and there are all kinds of political implications and takes on that. I think the consensus, though, when you talk to anybody across the aisle, is that this question is untested. The citizenship question was not included in the 2018 Rhode Island test, which is a sort of dress rehearsal for the Census Bureau. So that means we really don't understand the implications of what that citizenship question is going to mean. I think there's some research coming out from Harvard early next year looking at that. I think the Census Bureau itself is going to do some testing, but I think there's a general consensus that it's going to make it even more challenging to reach those already hard to count communities. The rise of disinformation and misinformation. So another area that's new in 2010 that we didn't really have to deal with in 2010, or sorry, and new in 2020 that we didn't really have to deal with in 2010. So much of what we've seen happen in the 2016 elections, in the midterms, we are anticipating seeing around the decennial. And that's a big concern, and it's something that we're very ill-equipped to deal with. So that's going to be something that we really have to fortify ourselves and start to think about now. Security concerns. So again, the first digital census means there are all kinds of different ways for hacking and creating, activities through phishing schemes and other kind of breaches that we just didn't have to deal with in 2010. And so that's going to be something that cities and counties and states really need to be prepared for and thinking about right now. Internet proficiency and access. So there are quite a few cities that have low broadband, and this is an area that has been flagged by the Census Bureau itself as a really important factor in whether or not people are going to have not just access, but understand how to participate. I will note that in areas that the Census Bureau has flagged as having low broadband or internet proficiency and access issues, they are planning to send paper forms out in addition to the online response. But again, that's another issue that we haven't had to deal with as much prior to 2020. And finally, as I'm sure you're all very aware, we're in a very challenging political and media environment in the sense that we just don't know how a tweet or how a story or how a headline might impact participation around the census. And so that's a real concern. The instability around sort of the political and media environment right now means that anything can happen, and we have to be prepared for that. So this is just a starting point and not a deep dive. In the paper that I'm publishing next month, we go into a little bit more detail on these and how some of those things might impact cities in particular. That's just a quick snapshot. So if you're a city and you're thinking to yourself, okay, how do we know, or how do I know if my city is at particular risk? How do we know if we might be at risk of an undercount? So the good news, bad news is that it's a really challenging thing to try to determine, but there are some things that we know that matter based on emerging research, both from the U.S. Census Bureau and other organizations who are doing research on this topic. So cities that have high and historic hard-to-count populations, obviously, fragile internet infrastructure and low broadband, like I mentioned. State support. Has your state started a complete count commission? How is the federal or the state finance for the census looking? The state of California, for example, has a very sizable budget and has been sort of ahead of the curve with their organizing at the state level and now at the county and now at the city level. Limited municipal resources. This is obviously something that most cities struggle with. Political instability. Will there be an elected official change? Exposure to natural disasters. This is something that people often don't think about. But in a city like New Orleans or Miami that have sort of exposure to natural disasters, that can be actually a really big risk factor. And especially as we talk about NARFU, the non-response follow-up, that can be enormously impacted by time of year and natural disasters. And then finally, as I mentioned before, if you've had an undercount in the past, that's definitely a red flag that that's a possibility for 2020. The Census Bureau has identified some specific demographic groups, what they kind of loosely call hard to count, hard to enumerate, low response score. There are a number of different ways to describe it, but in short, it's largely a lot of the groups that are historically difficult to turn out to vote. So young people, folks with limited English proficiency, so non-native English speakers, those with limited internet proficiency and access, Asian and Latinos, renters, and a number of different groups that fall under those categories. And typically, those groups tend to be, you tend to have more than one of those characteristics in one group. So just as an example of what this at-risk assessment might look like, New Orleans has a number of the characteristics that make a city high risk for an undercount. So they have a young population, they have a high ratio of African American residents, they have a pretty high level of residents with less than a high school degree, lots of renters, 53.6%, 41% have lack of fixed broadband, fiscal issues at the state level, and then finally, they're prone to unexpected natural disasters. So New Orleans and other cities that have a sort of litany of different issues may be at high risk of an undercount. And so those are the things that folks in cities like New Orleans, like Albuquerque, and Providence need to be thinking about right now. Okay, so now that you have a little bit of a doom and gloom scenario, and I hate to do that, but I always say I just want to scare you just enough to get you motivated so you can get started. We really are coming up against a timeline here. So as you see, January 2020, we're basically a year out from when the census will start. And for anyone who knows, organizing at the city level or state level, much less federal level, we're already pretty late in the game. So January 2020, field offices are going to open up around the country. February, group quarter enumeration begins. So that's like college campuses, that sort of thing. March is when the real sort of effort, the real drumbeat will begin, kind of the latter part of March, where folks can start to self-respond over the phone or online, and in some cases over paper form. April 1st is going to be the big, splashy kind of call to action census day. And then May, we're going to begin non-response follow-up. So that's when you get the folks actually coming to doors and knocking on doors. And then the non-response follow-up operation ends by August in 2020. So it's a relatively wide window, except when you think about the fact that this involves every person in the United States, every resident, and counting them only once and in the right place. It's a pretty monumental undertaking. And so what that means is that cities need to start right now. And by that, I mean, at least right now, thinking about building your team, having a census lead. And if you can't have a census lead, at least buying out an existing staffer's time so that they can have, a 2 or 3 days a week to be starting to put together your strategy and building the right team internally that's sort of cross departmental. So you want, GIS folks and neighborhood engagement folks, and in some cases a CFO or chief performance officer, so they can actually look at the ROI on investing money in census. Form or joining a complete count committee. So often these are started at the state level, and then counties will create their own, and cities as well. So the city of Baltimore the city of Los Angeles. There are a lot of cities actually that have already started their complete count committees. So this is a really sort of straightforward way to start. There are a lot of resources the Census Bureau has on the Complete Count Committee, and we're actually going to talk about Complete Count Committees in our the Playbook, which I'll talk about in just a second. And then finally, identifying who the hard to count communities are in your city. So those could be very different depending on if you're in, Salinas, California versus Orlando, Florida versus New Orleans versus Rhode Island, Providence. So it's really important that you have a sense of who the hard to count communities are and where they are. And I'll show you in a second how you can start to do that. But really all three of these things are the sort of foundation for what should be a much more extensive get out the count strategy that your city can start to build. But these are the sort of starting blocks, and I think it's hard to do much without having these three pieces in place. So in terms of resources, I want to point you to a few Census Bureau resources. So the first one is the Rome tool. So Rome is a hard to count map that is available, publicly available at census.gov/Rome. And I'll share the link in just a second. I see it's not coming up here. It's a fantastic tool. So what you're looking at right now is a map of Albuquerque. The darker blue areas are the hardest to count or low response score in census parlance areas. And then the lighter the colors, the yellows and the lighter greens have higher response. And so just a snapshot of this one Census Tract 21, we can see that there are about 1,200 people in that area, has a median household income of $19,000 roughly. They have about 4% population under 5. If you keep scrolling down, I don't have it up right here, but it tells you language is spoken at home. It describes a number of different characteristics that would be very informative for developing a really micro-targeted communications and get out the count strategy at a census tract level, which is pretty game changing, because this kind of information wasn't available in 2010. So this is something that can be a powerful tool for cities to use, and anyone interested in formulating a get out the count strategy and a targeted communication strategy in those areas. Next, and this is a little bit of a plug for some of the work that that my team did when I was CIO at Census, but a little bit biased, but I think it's really, these are fantastic resources. So if you go to census.gov/partners, you will find a number of different resources and toolkits. There are two in particular I want to point out. The first one is Census Solutions Workshop Toolkit. So this is basically a guide to running community-based workshops that allow everyone from a church to a corporation to engage using the design thinking process. But really the goal is to get folks to commit and to talk about what they can do and uniquely contribute to get out the count efforts. So what you see on the screen here is just a snapshot of what's in that toolkit. These workshops have been ongoing for the last, I think, about 18 months now. You can do one in as little as an hour, or you can do a full day workshop, depending on your capacity. Having run some of these myself, having designed this program, I can vouch for it strongly. We have, while I was at Census Bureau, we ran this program with companies ranging from Twitter and Uber and Lyft and tech companies to community-based organizations and faith-based communities. So the framework is really flexible, and it's one that is intending to generate buy-in from your constituents and from your community. And so it's something that we think is a really powerful tool for cities to use and counties as well. I talked a little bit about a complete count committee. I do know that complete count committees across the country are starting to use this mechanism to generate commitments. And we're starting to get really positive feedback from those groups. The next toolkit I want to point out is the Community Outreach Toolkit. So this is basically a guide for developing outreach mechanisms that are evidence-based, that are leveraging the behavioral sciences and behavioral economics for increasing participation and uptake. This was developed in partnership with the Office of Evaluation Sciences, so a team of behavioral scientists who worked very closely with us to develop this. Oh, I don't know why there we go. And finally, and then we'll open it up to questions. I am going to be leading a Census Cities Sprint, Get Out the Count Sprint, starting late January, early February, that will bring cities through a process of actually developing a Get Out the Count strategy. And we will have guest lectures from the Harvard Kennedy School, Census Bureau leadership, folks who've done get out the vote efforts, Affordable Care Act enrollment, human-centered design, community organizing. It's going to be a really, really strong program, and will culminate in participants actually having a deployable, usable get out the count strategy that their city can use. And it's intentional and intentionally available to small cities as well as larger cities. So this is something that if you're a small town and don't have a lot of resources you can use, and if you're a city with a census director or chief census officer, you should find it valuable as well. So we will have signups for that for the next 3 weeks, I believe, and I've included a link. So if it's something that you're interested in, please feel free to sign up on the form, and we will contact you. And this is the link to the form. So it's a little bit hard to grab, but it is in the chat box. And of course, if you have any questions, you can also use that form to ask questions as well. I'm not sure it was clear up front, but I will be publishing a paper called How Cities Can Save the Census, a local framework for our nation's first digital count, as well as an open source playbook that cities can use. And then, of course, the sprint, all in January at the Harvard Kennedy School Shorenstein Center. So anyone who's interested in learning more, there will be a number of resources coming out in January that will be available to you. And I will stop there.
Kyla, that's great. Thank you so much. And thank you for all of this information. I know here at What Works Cities, we're definitely excited to boost both your playbook and your paper and get folks to join the sprint, because it sounds like a really amazing opportunity. For anyone who is on the line, we'll open it up for questions now, and you can also feel free to Slack them, or I'm sorry, not Slack, but send them in the chat box function, and then we'll pass them off to Kyla. Any questions from the line? Great, we've got one question from Eric Roche. He wants to know, is there a cost to the sprint, Kyla?
Oh, there you go. That's a great question. Right now, I'm trying to, we're working on making it publicly available and free for all participants.
That's great. He says, thank you. Any other questions on the line or in the chat box? Okay, amazing. Well, we're gonna go ahead and give everyone back a little bit of time then. Thank you so much, Kyla, for joining and for doing this webinar with us, and we will share the archive presentation and also all of the upcoming resources that Kyla's developing in January as they come out. Have a happy holiday season, everyone, and we look forward to another year's worth of webinars in 2019.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Great, thank you.